Hiking, camping, and hunting are some of my very favorite things to do. I've had some pretty crazy experiences with animals, not behaving like they're supposed to. I've been chased by creatures that are supposedly meant to be docile, and even had a mountain lion walk straight past me. But the story I tell over and over is the time that I saw what I truly believe to be a Sasquatch. I was down in Utah and trying out some ultimate survival skills in order to run a course back home. I feel confident that I'm tough and can deal with most things you might experience out in the wild, and know the places to stay the hell away from. I might be a survivalist, but I'm not going to intentionally put myself in the path of a mama bear or a hungry pack of wolves, even with my gun. So I don't go looking for trouble necessarily. I just teach how to survive if trouble finds you. And that day, I truly believe if I hadn't had my wits about me, I would have been Sasquatch dinner for sure. I was nearing the end of the session down there anyway, when I took a deep hike. I had my gun holstered on my belt, just in case. There was just wading through the undergrowth when I am hit by the most god-awful smell. It was terrible. I probably ain't no daisy myself, but this was terrible. Like 1,000 skunks had all set off their stink, and then died. You get the picture. I'm thinking I'm about to come across some rotting corpses, like a maggot-infested deer, or something, but I can't spot anything on the ground. Then, the trees start shaking, and I could hear this noise. It was like a boom. There's either going to be an earthquake, or something massive is coming through the trees. Then I see it. It doesn't come too close, leaving itself some room, but it is massive and partially hidden by the trees. But I could see this huge mass of what looked to be a body, very resembling of a bear or a gorilla. Then, something hit me. I look down, and it's a small rock. The more hit me, and I see this huge creature is pummeling me with rocks in my direction. And that was when I made the connection. Disgusting smells, huge footsteps, and a large body. Now the stones being thrown at me. I've only ever heard of these kinds of things through tales. There's no doubting this was indeed a Bigfoot. Could I have possibly stumbled across its territory or gotten too close to its home? Unfortunately, I didn't get the chance to investigate further, as it started throwing bigger and bigger rocks, and one nearly caught me in the face. I thought I'd get the hell out of there before it killed me. Interestingly enough, this being, whatever it was, assuming it was a Bigfoot, could have easily killed me while throwing rocks at me. But it wasn't. It was intentionally missing me, throwing small rocks, as if trying to get my attention to beat it. I truly wonder if it really wanted me out of there. And maybe, just maybe, it smelt me first, which is why it was drawn to me. One thing I know for sure now is that Bigfoots are real. When I was just a kid, we had a couple of cousins that lived way out in the countryside. They were full-on proper hillbillies, that was for sure, but with hearts of gold, and I loved visiting them. We'd play for hours out in the woods back then, and we were actually allowed to be out all day, or until our bellies rumbled for food. The woods were likely full of all sorts of dangerous stuff, but they were the kind of people that you thought you had to learn from your own mistakes, and to not coddle the kids. It was great. Tree climbing, den building, swinging across the river. We'd come home covered in filth and bruises, and my aunt would always just say, "Did you guys have fun?" We'd always tell them we did. So, the day we came running back to the house after having been only out for a couple of hours, tears streaking down our faces, and more than down my youngest cousin's leg, they knew something must have happened. We told them that we were playing far in the woods, down by the old creek and the tire swing, and all of a sudden, we smelled this terrible smell. and the first thing we did was blame each other. But it was 100 times worse than even a fart could be. A rustling noise and brush. We turned, and we saw it. Some sort of half-man, half-gorilla watching us. It made us scream. This thing was huge, and it was looking at us high up in the trees. Its face was kind of like a monkey. It was really tall and covered in dark reddish hair. It opened its mouth and roared, and we all saw just how massive its teeth were. We ran. We were then told by my uncle, he and my older cousin Dale had grabbed their guns and headed back to that exact spot. When they came back, they hadn't found a thing, but the smell, that god-awful stench, lingered, and there was also some footprints, is what appeared. I swear, my uncle looked like he'd actually seen a ghost. Pale. He said the footprints were huge, much larger than any of their shoe size, and my uncle is practically a size 13-14. He told us boys that we weren't allowed to go back, ever. In his opinion, we had seen ourselves a Squatch. This story takes place when my grandfather was still very much alive. He was the kind of man that spent literally every waking hour of his life working as a rancher, squeezing every dime out of every last second of his time. It paid off. He was able to retire quite handsomely and get a comfortable house in the middle of 17 acres of forest. If that doesn't sound isolated, well, it was. He never did like people, and I was kind of lucky that he liked me. He was every bit of the old man stereotype that shakes his fist and tells people to go away. More often than not, when he wanted to spend time with me, I ended up being his bouncer. Any stray sounds in the woods surrounding his home was an intruder, and I had to be the one to go on and tell them to get off. It always ended up being a squirrel, or a falling branch, or some other ridiculous benign non-human cause. He was kind of psychotic, so I guess you could assume that by this point. But that didn't dissuade him one bit. If he heard it, he had to attack it. His successful retirement hadn't upgraded his diet by much. He still had me over for some stew right out of the can. And when we were eating, we had heard a sound that was on the level of thunder, only it wasn't coming from the sky. It couldn't have been. The skies being perfectly clear. I can vividly remember his face getting red and telling me to go chase the kids off his land. I believe that there was something to this time, because whatever that sound was, it was deafening. I was pretty apprehensive in going out to take care of this problem. All I had was a revolver that he had gifted me when I was 16. It was better than nothing, but still. I entered a clearing in the woods where I found the source of the clamor. I could scarcely believe my eyes, and it was kind of a miracle that I didn't mess myself on the spot. Nothing in all my years could have prepped me for what I saw. Ever heard of a Bigfoot? I mean, who hasn't by now? But have you ever heard of a snowy white albino Bigfoot? Maybe that's a little new, at least for me. Heard of a snowy white Bigfoot having a violent encounter with other wildlife? It might sound like something out of a novel, but that's what I was seeing. This thing was huge, like you'd expect, and for some reason, a group of timber wolves had decided to pick a fight, and this big white Bigfoot, assuming that's what it was, grabbed one wolf and tore it in half like it was nothing. The other one was grabbed and nearly choked to death. It was terrifying. I was horrified, but they weren't discouraged, and they kept attacking. Then, this thing grabbed a third wolf and grabbed it by the legs and slammed it up against the tree, nearly breaking its back, as if it were a dead rabbit. I ran for fear of my own life and safety. Then, I had to tell my grandfather that there was this thing, a Bigfoot, wrecking several timber wolves He reacted about the way you'd expect. His eyes got wide, and he waited for me to tell him more. But he might not have believed me right then and there. He called me a few years later to tell me that he saw a Bigfoot, a white one that I told him about before. I know there are more terrifying things than a Bigfoot, but the entire experience and visual of it all left me with a sense of smallness. If wolves are nothing more than field mice in the eyes of some things on Earth, then what are mere men? I guess I shouldn't be so shaken up over seeing things in this new perspective, but I'd spent my life seeing men in a place in the universe that they apparently didn't really occupy. It's really done something to me. It's changed me, and not in a good way. This is hands down one of the scariest encounters I've ever seen in my life, and it tells me that we are definitely not on top of the food chain anymore. While I was growing up, my best friend was a border collie. We named her Cindy. Cindy was as wild as you would expect the breed to be. And if you know anything about border collies, well, it shouldn't be a surprise. She was the usual black and white. And even though we didn't have any sheep, since they're amazing sheep herding dogs, she behaved every bit like a sheepdog toward me. I was the livestock that she had to keep corralled. So it was something of a game between her and I to just see how far I could get before her instincts kick in, and she had to come collect me, or whatever it was she was doing in her brain. At the time, we lived at the edge of an expansive pine forest deep in Nebraska. There was no shortage of timber for us to roam around in. For obvious reasons, my parents preferred that I did not go into the woods by myself. I mean, I was only 7 at the time. But as any parent of a child of 7 years of age, children exist only to push whatever boundary is in front of them, much to the dismay of creatures like parents and even sheepdogs. If you're hearing this story on a certain Cryptid Encounter podcast, then you know I have a story for you that didn't end well. It was one of those getaways that should not have happened. My parents were not around. Their friends were around, and so was Cindy. Plus, they had sternly charged me not to run off into the woods. So, with that many sets of eyes, I shouldn't have been able to get away undetected. Somehow I did. As soon as I sensed a window of opportunity, I booked it to see how far I could get before Cindy came looking. I had already long forgotten about the adults. I got a pretty good head start, and then I began to get lost. No adults and no dog came looking. I lost my bearings, and I couldn't find my way back at the time. So, I entered into a very small clearing, where there was a small pond. I was enchanted to the point that I forgot about getting back. Something moved in the shadows of the trees, and that's when I was confronted by the biggest living thing I had ever seen or known in my life. It resembled a monkey, but was very man-like in appearance. I guess I used to call it a mountain monkey, if that makes sense. I wasn't entirely sure if I should be afraid or fascinated. The thing's face was a mixture of curiosity and puzzlement, and yet I could tell it seemed to be devoid of any friendliness. Just as it was reaching one hand, Cindy appeared, and she put herself between me and this giant monkey thing, and began barking like crazy, her hackles raised and her teeth bared. This only fascinated this creature even more, or this monster, whatever it was. The creature just reached out toward its hand and tried to grab onto Cindy. But that's when I was truly terrified, because it somehow grabbed her and then choked her to death. And when I mean choked her, I don't mean in a traditional sense. It literally grabbed her and crushed her like she was a Coke can. That's when I panicked and fled, crying hysterically, screaming. I slammed into my father, who was completely livid. He wasn't sure if he should be happy to see me or be full of rage. After everything calmed down, the question was naturally raised as to the whereabouts of Cindy. At 7 years of age, I tried to tell them as best I could, with my very limited vocabulary, that this giant monkey man killed her. But they wouldn't understand what I meant for a very long time. A lot of people say they have had a hard time shooting Bigfoot or Sasquatch, whatever, when they see it, because it just looks far too human. I have a feeling that if I ever encountered it again, and I'm armed, I would have zero problems taking revenge and taking a shot right between the eyes. The sound of my dog struggling for its life while it was being crushed alive is now this vivid traumatic memory in my mind and will forever be. My parents, however, at the time were convinced I saw a bear that killed Cindy. How wrong they were.